have the honor to chair today's very interesting talks on the keyword of crime. So as technology leapfrogs ahead of us, we see what are the different aspects of this at the intersection of technology and communities. So the first speaker that we have is Professor Nishant Sastry from the Distributed and Network Systems Group at the Surrey Centre for Cybersecurity, the Department of Computer Science here at the University of Surrey. His talk is titled, "Can We Agree on Online Hate? And Some Lessons from Citizens MP Conversations on Twitter." Dr. Sastry is also a visiting researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, where he is co-lead of the Social Data Science Special Interest Group. He holds a bachelor's degree with distinction from the RV College of Engineering, Bangalore University, a master's again in computer science from the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD from the University of Cambridge. He's also spent 6 years in industry at Cisco Systems and IBM Software Group USA, and also in industrial research labs such as the IBM Watson Research Center and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Computer Science and AI Lab. His talk today is based on a project that has just finished with the Alan Turing Institute on developing a meta tool for hate speech detection, and an online project with the UK House of Commons Research Library on digital citizen engagement and understanding abusive language in citizen MP conversations. So without much further ado, I hand over to Professor Sastry.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Let me first try and share slides because that's usually an issue with these online things. And let me know if you do see in full screen.
Not yet. We see your slides. Yes, it's now full screen. Thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you so much for that introduction. So I guess I've got until 2:25 or so to speak, if I'm not wrong. So please let me know when I'm going over time. So what I'm interested in is our elected representatives, such as Boris Johnson that you see here, and ordinary people, citizens of this country, such as you and me, who might be interacting or who might want to interact with their elected representatives. Now, this is interacting with your elected representative, as the word representative says, they're actually our representatives, but getting in touch with them, getting them to actually respond back to our queries has always been a challenge in the past. So you might have to, MPs do have scheduled surgeries, so you might go and attend some of these surgeries. You might try and send them a letter or an email, or maybe even leave them a message on their phone and hope for them to get back to you. But more often than not, many of these queries may not be answered, or even if they're answered, it's not something that's available for others to actually have a look at. What's changed in the past, let's say less than 10 years actually, is that most of these MPs, from just being a handful of MPs being online on platforms such as Twitter, nearly 600 out of the 650 MPs that the UK has at Westminster are now online on Twitter. So your ordinary citizen can just send them a tweet at their Twitter handle via their smartphone or laptop or whatever. And then there is the expectation that the MP will respond back, and the MP usually also responds back fairly quickly as well. And what's more important is that because of the public nature of Twitter as a platform, all of this data, all of this interaction that MPs might have with their constituents and other citizens in the UK is now completely available as a matter of public record on Twitter, and researchers like me can apply the lens of data science to look at the networks that form, look at the communities that form, and this is sort of one of the research focus areas that I have. And in particular, today, what I want to address is this question that we've been asking about whether, in fact, there is online hate in this interaction. This is an actually important conversation that's happening online every day today. And this is a project that we are doing together with the House of Commons Research Library, as Suparna just pointed out. And it's an ongoing project, but it builds on a project that we did together with the Alan Turing Institute, where I'm a member as well. So the story for this whole online conversation sort of goes is actually the history of this is not that old if you think about it. Around about early 2000s, for those of you who can recall that time, people actually didn't have social networks. People didn't even have smartphones, and then suddenly things changed, and things changed very rapidly. And 2006 is what I consider as the sort of a pivotal point for people getting engaged with this new content revolution, with this so-called user-generated content. This was about the time when there was a big wildfire in San Diego. And what happened was that somebody actually on Twitter was able to capture an image of that and post it on Twitter. And they did that sooner than the cable news networks of the world, CNNs and the Fox News and everybody else were able to get to that area. So in some sense, ordinary citizens were being faster than these professional news networks. And so Time, which around December every year comes up with this nominates a person called the Person of the Year, and it's usually notable persons such as Barack Obama has been a Person of the Year. And it's just notable, right? So there's people like Osama bin Laden has been a Person of the Year before as well. But in 2006, they said the Person of the Year was you, people like you, me. And they said we were the Person of the Year because we seized the reins of the global media. We founded and framed a new digital democracy. We were working for nothing. So when somebody posts on Twitter, they are not actually making money off of it. And they're doing, but they're still doing the job, and they were beating the pros, they were beating the journalists at their own game. So they said Times Person of the Year is you, and it was and the face that was shown was a computer picture there. But 15 years on, what we have here is that face has turned into this person that you see, who was one of the ones who mounted the attack on the Capitol Hill on January the 6th earlier this year. And so suddenly, what was lauded as a great big opportunity has now become something which can be very dangerous and can upset and can get at the real roots of democracy itself. So this is something that we need to look at to see why is there online hate? How is this online hate coming up? And can we actually use quantitative computational tools to look at this question? So my own interest in these kind of online harm stems back from a few years back when we looked at the 2016 presidential elections where Trump was elected. And this was when we helped Craig Silverman over at BuzzFeed News when they did a massive expose on how hyperpartisan news sites were actually disrupting the US ecosystem and the news ecosystem. And what we showed there is what you see here. So you can see that there are these almost parallel universes where there is the conservative side and the democratic side, conservatives in red, Democrats in blue, the opposite of the colors that we tend to use here in the UK. They were hardly talking to each other, so they were like ships in the night, just not really communicating with each other. And this was not just the websites. We actually also looked at the corresponding Facebook pages that we had there. That each of these websites also had. And we see these two kinds of different universes, and this was a demonstration of how there's been this huge divide in US politics. And we can see that the right tends to amplify the views within the right, the left to a lesser extent, but still in a similar fashion amplifies views within the left, but there's hardly any interaction or any amplification going on across the party aisles at all. Right. More recently, we've actually been looking at how this kind of splitting or balkanization of the US politics has actually been affecting the users, and we are looking at web privacy. And what we've been able to show is that, in fact, many of these sites actually do something called differential tracking. This is a phenomenon that we just identified, where we can show that if you belong to a certain kind of demographic, such as if you're a woman or if you're a senior, for example, you might tend to be tracked much more on certain kinds of websites than in other kinds of websites. And what's more important is that if those kinds of demographics, which are actually tracked more, are actually more lucrative for the website. So the websites are actually making more money off of you with more expensive ads that they're being able to serve you with more tracking and so forth. So this what seems like this is fine, this is okay, this can happen as well, actually does have fairly serious consequences. Moving from the US context to the UK context, this is a project that we started a couple of years back with the House of Commons Research Library. And what we were interested in was in the UK, there's a lot more democratic use of Twitter as a platform. And so what we were interested to see was, can Twitter actually serve as a platform for re-engaging the younger population, for re-engaging the citizens with the democracy, because there was this, there's always been this fear, or there's always been this perception that democracy is sort of interest in democracy is sort of on the wane in the UK. So one of the results that we found there, we had several results, but I want to focus on one here, which is that instead of this parallel universe filter bubble type of scenario which we find in the US, what we find in the UK is exactly the opposite. So what this shows here is MPs, members of parliament of different parties on here, and users who are supporters of each of these parties on here. And as you might expect, a conservative supporter will talk to a conservative MP, a Labour supporter talks to a Labour MP, and so forth. So you expect to see, and the colors here, the hotter the color, the redder the color, the more the interaction that we have here. You expect to see a lot of interaction along these diagonals here. This is what you would expect from a partisan population, and there we do know that people are supporters of different parties. But what we see is that, in fact, there's a fair number of there's a fair generalization here, where supporters of all parties tend to talk to the conservative MPs who are in power, tend to also talk with Labour MPs who are also on the front bench and so forth. And in fact, if you go down to parties such as the Liberal Democrats, what we see is, in fact, there's more discussion with conservative MPs than with their own MPs, right? So there's significant cross-party talk here, which is the opposite of what we found. So is this a good idea? Is this good? Does this show that our democracy here in the UK is actually functioning well? Well, to answer this question, we actually have to see what is the tone of this conversation. And we can look at various affect features, such as whether there's positivity, negativity, anxiety, anger, sadness, and so forth. And what we see is that, unfortunately, there's a lot of negativity, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of anger being expressed. And this is 1.0 is a sort of normalization that you can find in any language corpus. So if it's more than 1.0, then something is being overexpressed. And I'll give you a second to think about which bar represents which. One of them is the citizens and one of them is the MPs. But to just give the answer away, it's the left bar. It's the citizens who are expressing more negativity, anxiety, and anger, and so forth. There is also some positivity. In fact, there is more positivity here than you would expect in a general language corpus, but you do see this negativity here as well. So that was where we were at until we started in January this year, this new project where we wanted to delve deeper into this and see whether is it just some sort of negativity, or do we actually find hate speech in this corpus. I mean, one of some of the questions that I get from a more computer sciencey audience is, well, you know, I really don't have an opinion about my MP at all. I barely even know who they are. I don't know their name. Do you really expect people to have strong enough opinions to actually have hate speech utterances towards them? So let's see, MPs are, yes, the MPs are not your average footballers. They're not celebrities. They're not actors and so forth. So, but they do tend to get tweets, right? So this is Priti Patel, who right now is a Home Secretary, but in the data set that we were looking at, she was the International Development Secretary of State. And what we find is that, mostly she's nowhere to be seen. Nobody's really interested in talking or engaging with her, except in this one instance where she was starting to get nearly 9,000 tweets every day. And this was when she went off to Israel, talked to people there in the Israel government without actually telling the Whitehall officials, and then there was a controversy which led to her resignation later on. So it is possible that there is, at some instances, there is a huge amount of influx, a huge amount of incoming tweets towards Priti Patel in this case. So perhaps there is hate here, right? And we call such things as unanticipated focus, and I'll just leave that word there because it was not anticipated, and contrast it with someone like Theresa May, who is in the world of MPs. In our data set, she was a celebrity because she was the prime minister at that time, so she regularly got quite a number of tweets, on average more than 1,000 tweets a day. But you still see these kind of periodic patterns over here, and there are these peaks here. The political scientists among you might have guessed at the reason. This is PMQs, Prime Minister's questions. So it's like a very theatrical exercise that tends to happen in the UK. And lots of questions get asked, which then leads to a huge amount of Twitter engagement as well. And perhaps there is hate here as well. So we want to measure this hate, right? And this is anticipated focus in contrast with the unanticipated focus that we saw earlier. So can we actually measure this hate? And so we engaged with legal experts, and this is one of the facets that I try to bring into my research, is to actually engage with people from the social sciences and arts and humanities who have a much better knowledge of the actual domain than I do. I bring in the methods expertise, and I try to work with the social scientists for places where I actually don't have the expertise. So what we found was that actually even in the legal framework, there isn't a really established consensus on what hate speech is, right? So there are at least two major definitions or two major viewpoints that we can adopt. One is that of hate speech based on European Court of Human Rights, and it's built on case law. And there's a definition of hate crime. And the hate speech has to involve an element of a group element. There has to be incitement to violence, and this also has to be, the utterance has to be somehow disproportionate, right? So if I say something against a protected group, such as, I don't know, denying the Holocaust, for example, if I try to incite violence, and if I do that in a disproportionate way, then I'd be susceptible to be prosecuted through this hate speech. Now, this looks very similar, where you again have a protected group where you need to have harassment and distress and anger, alarm being caused, so it looks fairly similar, but actually there's a substantial difference here. One is against a group, whereas the hate crime, for it to be considered as a criminal act, has to be against an individual who is part of this protected group, right? There's a third one, which is using tort law, which we won't get into in too much of depth. So there's again huge differences here in terms of the group element and the protected group not exactly being the same. So, for example, gender is not yet considered as a protected group for hate crime, and this is being remedied currently through legislation that's ongoing. But currently, these two are not exactly quite the same. We also have a problem trying to do this in a automated sense, because it's very hard to show that there is incitement. It's very hard to say that something is disproportionate or that it has actually caused harassment or distress or alarm. Right. So these are kind of some of the. I'm just trying to give you a sense of the difficulties that we end up having to face. And even more fundamental difficulties, in fact, there is no agreement among the stakeholders on what should be considered as hate. So you could have regulators who are trying to balance freedom of expression versus the societal spillover that might happen. You're having content platforms who are trying as best as possible to not be very annoying to the user, and to also not actually have to face this regulatory burden if they let things pass, and that leads to regulators coming after them with a huge stick. So what we've done is we've actually combined these several different approaches from several different previous researchers as well, and we've created a meta tool. And this was the project with the Alan Turing Institute, and we've released that as a tool which other people can use here. And right now we're using this tool to look at in great detail at the data set that we have of the MPs talking to citizens and vice versa, to see whether we actually have hate towards women MPs, towards minorities. Is one party sort of hated more, perhaps because they're in power, or perhaps because in a position? Are there certain topics which tend to incite this kind of violent, hateful behavior, and so forth? So watch this space. And I'd like to sort of conclude by actually acknowledging our funders, and as well as the excellent team that we have. This is Noel Dempsey, Ollie Hawkins, who are seconded to the university from the House of Commons Research Library, Edward Wood, who is the Director of Research there at the Research Library, who is my counterpart there in this project, and Pushkal Agarwal and Margarita Maxapolo, who are the students working on it from a computer science and a legal perspective. And I will leave it there.
So we move to the next talk in our featured set of talks, where we have Dr. Michael McGuire from the Surrey Centre of Cybersecurity and the Department of Sociology, on the topic of When Worlds Collide, Nation States, Cyber Conflict, and the Politics of Crime. Dr. Michael McGuire joined the department as senior lecturer in criminology in September 2012. He read philosophy and scientific method at the London School of Economics, where he acquired a first-class BSc Economics, and he completed his PhD at King's College London, and he subsequently developed an international profile in the study of technology and the justice system, and has published widely in these areas. His first book, Hypercrime, The New Geometry of Harm, was awarded the 2008 British Society of Criminology Runners-Up Book Prize. And his most recent publication on technology, crime, and justice, The Question Concerning Technomia, is the first book in the field of criminology and criminal justice to attempt an overview of the implication of technology for the justice system. He's also just completed a research report in this area for HP on nation states, cyber conflict, and the web of profit, which unravels the existence of a complex and seemingly interconnected cybercrime economy, and how this operates in the context of the clear net, dark markets, social media platforms, and now nation states. So over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Aparna. Hopefully no technical problems this end. I'll try and share my screen.
That's good.
No, not that one. This one. Okay. Okay. So I'm going to talk about another aspect of technology, and I'll start by just making a few remarks about cybercrime. It's an area that I've been looking at for 15 years or so, and I have been very interested in the sort of the philosophical questions around the relationship between digital crime. Of course, it's got many names: cybercrime, digital crime, e-crime, you name it. And it's arguably something we could regard as the most technological of all crime categories, that there aren't other crime categories that include technology as part of the offending matrix. But we've got a real problem in terms of how we, not just in terms of the social science aspects of cybercrime, cyber security, people have a problem with this, legal theorists have a problem with this, is that it's very, very unclear about the relationship between the technology and the offending. You know, what is agentic in this? Is it the individual and their intentions, their intentions, their actus reus and their mens rea, what they intend to do that matters? To what extent is there some sort of causal connection between the technology, the digital technology, and the offending? Many crimes, of course, are referred to as cyber-enabled, is what I've referred to it, as opposed to cyber-dependent. There's this huge schism between crimes which could exist outside of the computer and crimes like the use of malware or DDoS attacks or something which seem to depend on the computer. Even those kinds of crimes, arguably, when they're theorised under the Computer Misuse Act, could be seen in terms of older types of offending like trespass, vandalism, and so on. So there's a real, fundamental problem that we've got in understanding the relationship between digital technology and crime, cybercrime as we want to know it. The general answer to this is that in some way the technology augments the criminal capacity. It helps them to do more than they could do before.
Sorry to interrupt you, Mike, but should we be seeing slides, as someone asks, because we don't see any slides yet?
I've done the share slides.
Screen share. You need to screen share your presentation.
Screen share. Oh, let's have a look. I thought I'd done that. Problem with my new laptop from Surrey is that the movable mouse pad doesn't seem to want to cooperate. Share content?
No, on the top, beside the leave call button, there should be a little arrow pointing upwards that should allow you to select the PowerPoint slide.
Yeah, I'm using that.
And there is a tray with various windows open, of one of which should be your PowerPoint presentation. Perfect. I think we're on the right track. We're getting somewhere. Yep.
You can see that.
There you go. Perfect.
Okay, I thought I did that already, but never mind, obviously not. So yeah, just whipping through what I just said. So in some ways, is the computer augmenting technological capacity, criminal capacity, or not? And there are real questions. Should we even think of cybercrime as a technological crime? Is the technology a bit of a red herring to what's really going on, which is human beings doing the sort of things they've always done when they try to gain illicitly or at other people's expenses? At the very least, and I think this is even something that coming from the cybersecurity world now, there's a realization that we need to think about this as in sort of composite terms, as a socio-technic phenomenon where technology and the social world combine in different ways. So one of the ways that I've tried to do that in some of my recent research is to think about, after all, the thing that cyber criminals are mainly interested in. We've seen Nishant's presentation on hate crime, but there's an extent to which even they're seeking some benefit, whether it's some slightly more abstract form of benefit. But fundamentally, there is some benefit or value being sought from the offending, some sort of advantage. And very often, of course, that is revenue driven. It's financial, and this is behind the big rise in fraud. So what I tried to do in a series of reports that I've published over the last 3 or 4 years is look at the web of profit, this interconnected web of revenue generating activities, how money is generated, how it's then laundered, how it's disposed of and spent. And I've looked at that across a different variety of digital contexts, from the clear net through to darknet markets. And it's pretty clear, once we start to look in detail at that, there is a very, very interconnected and complex set of relationships involving raw materials like data, ways in which revenue can be generated. And, what Emily's going to talk about, romance fraud is one example of that. There's a relationship between protagonists, between producers, consumers and victims. There are tools that are used. There are quite well recognized production and supply centers and so on. So what we see when we think about cybercrime in this more socio-technic form is a very, very, very interconnected, holistic thing that we can think of as an economy, where crimes are committed, revenues are generated, these monies are laundered or then spent, and then very often they're recycled back into further cyber crimes, or sometimes wholly different crimes as well, and that's quite concerning. The economy, the cybercrime economy that is now functioning in the world is significant. It's very significant. We estimated it in the research to be worth around about $1.5 trillion in revenues annually, and that's at the minute. That's a conservative estimate. There's lots and lots of categories we couldn't include in that estimate. Not only is it obviously an appeal to recruit further cyber criminals, and it's significant in that respect alone, but it's such a large amount of revenues that are available that it's larger than the top 3 Fortune 500 companies combined. It's also larger than the GDP of many major nation states, including some quite large ones like Saudi Arabia. So, I mean, there are many implications of that which we haven't got time to explore now. But what I want to explore here is the impact that this economy, this cybercrime economy, is having upon nation states themselves, the interest they're taking in it, and the ways in which they're seeking to exploit it. And that's been the subject of the report I've most recently published, which is Nation State Cyber Conflict and the Web of Profit. And this asks 2 questions, which I'll discuss for the rest of this presentation. Firstly, what way do the strategic tensions that we're all familiar with between nation states in cyberspace connect with this cybercrime economy? What are the relationships there? And secondly, how is the global world order, the state of politics as we now find them, being affected by these tensions? To do this research, obviously it's notoriously difficult to get hold of data in the cybercrime world in general. We're only just beginning to improve our metrics, but when it comes to nation state related cybercrime, it's extremely difficult. So we had to adopt quite a wide ranging methodology. We assembled a database of around about 200 incidents, which we know have been associated with nation state struggles. We got insights from a variety of different practitioners across some fields you can see there, from law enforcement through to government intelligence and so on. We also drew upon the earlier research we've done in this world to talk to some of the vendors on the dark markets and the dark nets who've got some very interesting things to say about the kind of people they're dealing with at the moment, and then various other secondary sources in the public domain to build up the picture here. And 3 key trends really stood out from the research in terms of what nation states are doing. First of all, there's an escalation in the types of conflicts that we're seeing. Secondly, there's an intensification in the way these conflicts are being played out, both in terms of the complexity and the variety of what's happening. And then thirdly, and this is the one I want to really think about towards the end of the presentation, there's a kind of expansion in opportunity. Nation states are looking to exploit this cybercrime economy in a way which is, I argue, actually quite unique in terms of the global world order. So let's have a look at these in turn. First of all, escalation. It's pretty clear that something is going on in terms of nation states' willingness to engage with digital technology for their own illicit advantage. So if you look at the kind of events that we've got understanding of or knowledge of, it looks like they've more or less doubled. There's been a 100% rise in incidents between 2017 and 2020. So there's around about 125 distinct incidents that we know of. And again, I must emphasize, this is simply what we know of. There's probably a lot more going on behind the scenes that we don't know of or haven't filtered into the public domain. So this is about something now, about 10 publicly attributable attacks a month, and that was double from what it was in 2017. So clearly, in terms of the volume of these attacks, there's been a significant increase. Second component of escalation is the way that these attacks are beginning to interface with the kinetic form of conflict, with the physical world. So the incidents we looked at, around about 40% of them involved attacks upon or assets which had physical as well as digital components. You know, so you may have heard the news recently about the attack on this Iranian nuclear plant, probably by Israel, a follow-on from the famous Stuxnet attack a few years before that. And around about 20% of the cyber attacks we looked at had a direct correlation with pre-existing physical regional cyber conflicts. So in other words, the tensions that we see in the physical world, in the everyday world of politics, are quite clearly being escalated and multiplied, and to an extent the technology is enabling this within the digital sphere as well. The second trend that we saw in the research that we did was what I call intensification. And there were two components to this. One is the sheer variety of these attacks and the kinds of targets that they're seeking out. This is not straightforward, kind of government against government type of conflict. Round about 35% of the nation state cyber attacks are now beginning to target business and enterprise. So there are clear strategic imperatives going on in the world of capitals, which are looking at not just the political infrastructures, but the economic infrastructures of states, and seeking in some way to either benefit from them or to undermine them. There's around about 25%, together with 12% of government bodies. So it's roughly equivalent with the attacks on government if we take cyber defence and government bodies cumulatively, but still a little bit more than that. We're all familiar with the way that media and communication agencies have been regular targets now of competitor states. So about 14% of attacks involve those. And a rising figure now is critical infrastructures like water, gas, electric, all these kind of things that we need to survive. And these are beginning to be probed with increasing regularity. There was also a lot of variety in the types of weapons and what these weapons were being used for. So by far the largest sort of intention at the moment appears to be surveillance, gathering intelligence, gathering information, which constituted about 50% of the stuff that we looked at. But around about 15% would simply just getting onto networks, positioning yourself on there for later usage. And we've seen, I'll come to a couple of attacks in a minute that took place this year where this has clearly taken place. Damage or destruction, the kind of things that we more usually associate with tensions between nation states, we're at about 14%, but also rising, and stealing data and so on around about 8% at this point. The second feature of the kind of intensification of these nation-state conflicts in digital space was the complexity of the attacks, the complexity of the ways that states are engaging with each other in digital space. So around about 20% of the attacks we looked at used far more sophisticated weapons than simple, bog standard malware, such as malware which is targeted, i.e. which has been refined, which has been developed to hit either particular targets within a rival state infrastructure, or indeed individuals. We'll see in a few minutes, individuals are worryingly often the target of nation state interests now, the likes of you and I, depending on what we say and do. And there are many, many other sort of themes I could look at here, but one I'll just mention, which seems to have become increasingly important in the last couple of years, is what are called supply chain attacks. These in 2019 rose by about 78% over the previous few years. Supply chain attack, really, in simple terms, for those who aren't familiar with what they might be, involve, rather than hitting the target directly, they hit it indirectly through the software that they purchase, or through other supply needs that an institution or a government might have. You can get in through the back door that way, very much. So it's not surprising, perhaps, that we've seen this kind of rise, but sophistication involved in them is often quite staggering. So about 40% of breaches now are involving these indirect supply chain or other types of backdoor attacks. And the fact that that there's something that's very appealing to nation states can be evidenced quite readily by the fact that of 27 distinct supply chain attacks which analysts have looked at, over 8 or more distinct, and that's different nation states, were involved in these supply chain attacks. So it's a tool that's coming into the armory. It's a technique that's being explored increasingly with increasing interest by intelligence services and beyond. And the two examples which you may have come across in the news recently was the SolarWinds attack, where a company called SolarWinds did an update with a piece of software called Orion, which probably Russian-sponsored attackers managed to get inside that and then penetrate around about 18,000 organizations worldwide, including big government institutions like the US Treasury and Network 500 companies. You might wonder why they're all using the same software, and that's a question which the cybersecurity world needs to answer. But that vulnerability was able to be easily exploited by Russian intelligence agents. And then the second attack, which took place, I think, about March, April, or at least it came to notice there, was probably Chinese sponsored, also a very, very interesting, complex attack using exploits. These are vulnerabilities in the software which can be stored. And they managed to get into the Microsoft Exchange server, and a lot of emails, up to 60,000 organizations, had business emails and other confidential communications compromised. Something interesting about that attack, because it's not just about the usual IP theft, although that was involved, but also obtaining information which could be used at a later date against individuals in organizations. That's a different kind of an attack vector we see there, but the way that they conducted it was at an interestingly complex level. So finally, the third trend, which I wanted to complete my talk about, is this idea of expansion. There's lots of ways in which new opportunities are being expanded, and I did look at some of the COVID-19 opportunities that nation states are using. I won't talk about that here, but it's clearly that they've sought to exploit the pandemic for their own advantage. But what I was really interested in was looking at in the way that they've tried to make use of the cybercrime economy, and there are clear opportunities that are being presented to nation states as a result of this very valuable commodity. They're increasing interdependencies between what nation states do and how the cybercrime economy functions. So a couple of examples: nation state attacks often just use techniques which were originally refined by cybercriminals. Cybercriminality is going over into the techniques that nation states use, such as DDoS attacks, attempts to bring down servers through flooding it with requests. Of the attacks that we looked at, around about 50% of them involve tools which you could get from the darknet or cybercrime marketplaces. So in other words, far from there being, the kind of defense development initiatives that we're familiar with, and they build vast aircraft carriers or submarines, nation states are going into cybercrime marketplaces and buying tools off there. And there's a relationship that goes the other way around as well, because cybercriminals are also often getting the tools that they use to commit cybercrime from nation states. So this Eternal Blue exploit, famously, which is used in the WannaCry attack on the NHS and other famous attacks, came directly from the US National Security Agency, the NSA, as a result of a hack on that agency. And in addition, nation states often, of course, use cybercriminals to commit attacks on their behalf as proxies or mercenaries. There's an even more extreme way in which nation states are engaging with the cybercrime economy by actually profiting from it, behaving like robbers quite openly. So, for example, some of the analyses we did of different types of revenue generating activities by nation state. One nation state was generating up to 10% of the value of its exports through stealing IP. Another nation state was generating about 6% of its foreign currency reserves from activities like cyber espionage. And one nation state, and this is Russia, was generating 3 times the amount of revenues it got from its arms and weapons exports industry from fraud and other types of cybercrime activities. There are certain nation states, such as North Korea, which have actually almost just entered. They might as well be wearing the mask and the stripy jumpy. They become full-time participants in the economy. They openly engage in digital bank robberies. There's lots and lots of well-attributed examples of this fraud, money laundering, and a recent case of cryptocurrency fraud, which North Korea was involved in, generated around about 30% of their export revenues. So they're pretty significant. At the other end of the scale, there's revenues being generated by ostensibly legitimate activities, such as the sale of cybersecurity products, but clearly the sale of cybersecurity products depends upon cybercrime. So it fits in with the cybercrime economy. So Israel is generating revenues, for example, around about 10% of the value of its leading exports, 50% of the value of its next largest exports. But many of the products that its companies are producing, such as this Pegasus software, which has been used to hack into WhatsApp and other encrypted forms of communication by this NSO group, has been misused by authoritarian governments around the world. Notoriously, it seems to have been used by Saudi Arabia in monitoring the activities of Jamal Khashoggi in his ultimate assassination in the Turkish embassy. So the NSO group is now being prosecuted by various agencies around the world. So there's a clear crossover there between legitimate and illegitimate activity again. So to conclude, what are some of the implications that we might take from this increased engagement on the part of nation states in cybercriminality? Let's call it what it is. Well, it looks very much that digital technology is now, of course, it's got all these wonderful things that everyone talks about, you know, in terms of globalization and creating new markets and platforms and so on. But it's also at the same time generating what is potentially quite a dangerous and unstable new global order. Traditional conflicts, physical conflicts, kinetic conflicts are beginning to mix together with digital conflicts in ways which are quite novel and quite unpredictable. So one analysis, it's hard to measure this. People talk about cyber war and where we reach cyber war or not. But one way we tried to pin this down to something a bit more empirical was to look at some of the traditional indicators that previous analysts have looked at, which suggest the path to war. And we used 11 such indicators, things like the growth in the number of armaments, the expectations on the part of nation states that they would gain something without any loss, and so on. In 1999, there were about 2 of those 11 indicators you could see. By 2009, 7 were clearly in place. 2020, all 11 of the indicators that we set out appear to be in play. So, you know, there seems to be a clear suggestion that we're very much on the road to, we call it advanced cyber conflict rather than cyber war, just to not to be too alarmist about it. But this advanced cyber conflict at the same time, of course, is very much unlike traditional war, or even wars which aren't wars, like the Cold War. It's asymmetric. In other words, smaller states or smaller groupings can take on larger groupings. It's often invisible. You don't know it's going on in the same way as you would know if there was an air raid on London. We'd all know about it. It's invisible. It happens, you know, beyond sight. And it's, of course, something that it's always plausibly deniable. No nation state ever confesses to any of this stuff. So the kind of things that we know about from Russia and China, we know a lot less about what the UK and the USA and other sort of friendly allies are doing, because it's nothing that is spoken about. It's what we might call molecular. There can often be numbers of groups involved in any particular incident or conflict, unlike, you know, traditional war where there might be one nation state fighting against another. So you might have the nation state itself, you might have some of its proxies, its mercenaries, you might have cyber criminals involved in the incident, you might have red teams, you know, white hat hackers, all of them operating together in the same sort of theatre of conflict. It's global. It combines local with global interests. It can be personal, as I suggested. Often this conflict is directed at individuals, and the assassination of Khashoggi is one very notorious and tragic example. And it's hybridized. In other words, it combines increasingly physical forms of warfare with digital warfare. And finally, and this might be, for me as a criminologist, one of the most interesting implications of all, is we've arrived at a state where this kind of digital conflict is generating a wholly new kind of world order, which we might describe as criminal, cyber criminal. There is something inherently criminal about the way that states are conducting themselves at this point in history. In fact, crime, cybercrime, is now a strategic option. It's something that when our politicians and our leaders or rulers of different states sit down and talk about policy in the same room, one of the things they talk about is how they can commit crime in the digital sphere more effectively than their competitor states. Criminality in that sense is now a policy norm, and nation states, which of course have always been above the law since they make the law, are now acting outside the law in ways which I think we all probably should be concerned about. I'll leave it there for the moment. Thanks very much, Ranjana.